Okay, should we start? Okay, welcome back to the last session of today. So obviously, I'm not Victoria Elliott as indicated on your program. I'm Michael Beaulieu. I'm working as a researcher at Wild Animal Initiative, where we try to engage people into the field of wild animal welfare. We won't have any talks now about wild animals, unfortunately, but we had already some today. But if you want to know more about what we are doing, we will be here all the time, but especially tomorrow morning in the lobby at 8 o'clock. So if you want to have a private discussion with us, be there at 8 o'clock in the morning in the lobby. And otherwise, I will give a talk also tomorrow afternoon during the workshop at the same time as the workshop. Okay, so let's start with the first talk today. That will be a talk given by Anna McKay about farmed shrimps. Where are you, Anna? Okay, you are here.
Okay, can you hear me? Great. Hi everyone, I'm Hannah. I work at a think tank called Rethink Priorities. We work mostly on farmed animal welfare at the moment, and in particular in the last year or so, my colleagues and I have been writing a series of reports on farmed shrimp welfare. And today I'm going to talk about why we think that shrimp need to be brought into the academic field of animal welfare science. And just a quick caveat that when I say shrimp, I mean the same thing as prawn. I'm talking about both. It varies geographically from what you refer to them as. But yeah, when I say shrimp, I mean the decapod crustacean that can be called shrimp or prawn. So why specifically shrimp? There's three main reasons: the scale, the welfare issues they face, and the open questions there are about them. So starting with the scale, this was the first report that we worked on. And my colleagues estimated that 440 billion shrimp are slaughtered for human consumption each year. So we're talking a large scale here. And how does this compare to other farmed species? So it's much larger than farmed chickens, which are the most farmed terrestrial vertebrate. It's larger than farmed fishes, and it's only surpassed currently by farmed insects. And what about those that die pre-slaughter? So we also estimated the pre-slaughter mortality rate for larvae, post-larvae, and the juvenile subadult stage. And for the most farmed species, which is Penaeus vanameae, we found that about 16% are dying in the larval stage, another 16% in the post-larval stage, and then about 17% in the juvenile subadult stage. So this comes out at a cumulative mortality rate across the life cycle of about 41%, which for this species equates to roughly 255 billion individuals per year. So yeah, we also saw that when we looked across the literature and different reports from industry, it was very common to see across species reports of about half of shrimp dying before they reach slaughter age. So when you take this into account, that means that about 230 billion shrimp are alive on farms at any given moment. So we're talking a very, very large scale, and about half of them are dying before they even reach the slaughter age. So next, the welfare issues. So just to give you some context about shrimp farming also happens in these distinct stages according to the life stage. So larvae hatch from eggs in hatching tanks, they grow into post-larvae in larval rearing tanks, and then they grow into juvenile subadults in on-growing farms. And on-growing farms are often classified as one of extensive, semi-intensive, intensive, or super intensive. And what's varying across these farm types is the level of control that the farmer has over the water quality and other things, and then also stocking density. So stocking density drastically increases as farms become more intensive. And we are seeing a general trend towards intensification in the industry. And now a quick whistle-stop tour of the welfare issues that they face. My colleagues and I identified about 18 welfare issues, but I will go through them very quickly, so feel free to ask me questions about them at the end. So the first is water quality, and this includes things like low dissolved oxygen, high or low temperature, unoptimal pH or salinity, high ammonia, which can reach toxic levels for shrimp, and pollutants from things like agricultural runoff of pesticides. Then there's feeding. So farmers might underfeed shrimp. Feed constitutes one of the largest costs in farming shrimp, so it is possible that sometimes farmers are trying to save on costs by underfeeding them. And then they might also be malnourished depending on the feed type used. Next up is stocking density. It's fairly uncertain to what extent shrimp are or are not affected by stocking density, and I'll talk about that more when we get to the open research questions. But the few studies we have of the farmed species in the wild do show that they appear at very low densities, so it is possible that they are being affected. And high stocking densities can also cause things like cannibalism in some species. Then there's predators, so some outdoor farms are exposed to things like fish or birds which predate upon the farmed shrimp. And then there's eye stalk ablation. So female breeder shrimp will often have their eye stalk cut off to make them mature faster or spawn eggs faster. Then substrates. So in the wild, shrimp are often found clinging to grasses or crawling along the sea bottom. They'll often bury themselves into the sand at the bottom of the sea. But the farming environment is very different and is often quite barren. Often ponds will be lined with plastic or concrete. So shrimp aren't able to bury themselves and express those natural behaviors. Then there's transport. So shrimp are often transported between different facilities, and sometimes they're also transported across countries. So the two main methods of transport are in water, where they're put into tanks at usually very high stocking densities, and water quality can become an issue if the transportation time is very long. And there's also waterless transportation, where shrimp are put onto things like wood chippings and sealed in hermetically sealed containers. And this is often the technique used when they're being transported in planes across countries. Then there's harvest. So this is when shrimp are collected out of the pond at the end of the production cycle. So at this point, they're often being crushed against the net or against each other, and they're also being exposed to air. Then ice slurry slaughter. So this is the main slaughter method currently used by shrimp farmers, if they employ a slaughter method at all. And it's quite uncertain to what extent this is a humane method of slaughter. We don't fully understand yet if this is humane. So some farmers and some advocates are moving towards electrical stunning. And then finally, diseases. The shrimp industry in general has had a huge problem with diseases in the past few decades, and it doesn't seem to be slowing down anytime soon. So my colleagues and I evaluated all of these welfare threats according to the intensity, duration, and prevalence. So this equates to how much pain a welfare threat causes, how long that pain lasts, and how often that pain arises in the population. And the outcome of combining this information is the time spent in pain by the average shrimp for each welfare threat. And the intensity categories that we used are from the Welfare Footprint Project. So they are annoying, hurtful, disabling, and excruciating, with each one worse than the last. So this ranges from annoying, where the pain is aversive but doesn't disrupt your daily routine, and the animal can ignore the pain most of the time, all the way up to excruciating, where the pain isn't normally tolerated even for a few seconds, and the concealment of pain is definitely not possible. Usually excruciating pain would represent imminent death. These are our results. So on the left, you can see the welfare threats. On the right is the duration of pain from those welfare threats. And the bars represent the proportion of pain coming from each pain intensity category. And the thing that you can't see on this is that each of the welfare threats is weighted by the number of shrimp it affects. So I mentioned that only about 50% of shrimp are making it to slaughter age. So the ice slurry slaughter at the bottom there is weighted by about half to account for that. So we can see that high stocking density is causing a long duration of pain, but that most of that pain is in the annoying category, whereas ice slurry slaughter is causing a relatively shorter amount of pain to less shrimp, but most of it is in the disabling or excruciating category. So how you prioritize amongst these welfare threats would strongly depend on whether you think it's more important to avert the worst types of pain or the longest duration of pain. So we've seen that there is a huge scale and a myriad of welfare issues that shrimp are facing on farms. Next is the open questions. So my colleagues and I identified about 5 research questions that we think are the main priority to work on in order to start helping farmed shrimp. We came up with many more, but we've narrowed it down to 5 just for this presentation. The first one is aggregation preferences. So this comes back to what I was saying, that it's fairly uncertain whether stocking density is affecting shrimp. The results I showed you did assume that it was, and that's where the annoying pain was coming from, but it is possible that shrimp don't mind aggregating. So what's present in the literature currently is only indirect clues. So we can see things like reduced growth, even when water quality is controlled, retreat behaviors and dominance hierarchies at high stocking densities, and then the wild shrimp observations I talked about, where they are seen at very low densities in the wild. So what's missing from the literature currently is welfare-focused studies. So what's needed is to understand at what point stocking density impedes welfare, even when water quality is good. Next is just behavioral research in general. What's currently present is just a handful of ecological studies. What's missing is commercially accurate settings, and particularly data on how often shrimp swim versus crawl. So they are benthic creatures. They do spend a lot of time at the pond bottom, but we don't understand how much it goes against their preferences to have to swim instead of crawl. So what's needed is ethograms in commercially accurate settings, sampling how often and how many shrimp swim. And this would give us an understanding of how stocking density affects them, because at some stocking densities currently being used on farms, shrimp have to be swimming at any given time. Next is thermal preferences. So what's present is that we have an understanding of the critical thermal limits of shrimp and how their immunology is affected by different temperatures. What's missing is understanding their preferred temperatures. So what's needed is thermal preference studies looking at motivational trade-offs, like Professor Elwood talked about earlier. Next is environmental enrichment. So we do have studies of the impacts of substrates on production. So this includes things like how growth and survival are impacted, and that we do see reduced cannibalism when substrates of different varieties are introduced into the pond. What's missing is an operationalization of the minimal acceptable enrichment. So currently most farms have no enrichment. Is that the minimal acceptable level, or does there need to be some in the ponds? So we need preference studies of shrimp and their preferences relating to environmental enrichment, which could hopefully lead to concrete recommendations to be used on farms. And then the fifth and final one is sentience indicators. So as Professor Elwood mentioned, we have indicators of nociceptors, protective behaviors, and responses being affected by anesthetics in shrimp. However, the vast majority of this evidence is for Caridean shrimp over here on the evolutionary tree, whereas the vast majority of farmed shrimp are penniad shrimp over here on the evolutionary tree. So what's missing is penniads. This is a quote from the Crumpetel paper, which informed the UK Sentience Bill, where shrimp were included and recognized as sentient, but it just says that penniad shrimps have been barely studied, resulting in a much weaker case. So we need studies of pain and sentience indicators in penniads of all life stages. So that's the research agenda that we wanted to present for shrimp welfare. Those are the 5 main questions. And just quickly, I'll talk about why we think now is a good time to start working on farm shrimp welfare. The first is that the European Food Safety Authority is hopefully conducting a review of the literature on decapods in the next 4 years or so, resulting in an opinion paper. So now would be a good time to start putting out studies of shrimp welfare, because they do rely strongly on peer-reviewed evidence. Then there's certification schemes. So currently certification schemes mostly include things like sustainability and how they treat their employees, which are obviously very important, but welfare of the farmed animals themselves is generally missing from these schemes. And these schemes do also heavily rely on peer-reviewed literature. And currently most peer-reviewed literature is from industry or for industry. So again, we need some research that is from the point of views of the animals and advocating for the welfare of the shrimp. The third reason is that governments are starting to take notice. So I already mentioned the UK Sentience Act, but also a couple of weeks ago, the Dutch House of Representatives said that it was aiming to end eye stalk ablation in shrimp. So they are starting to take notice. And again, they are also relying on the scientific literature in order to make recommendations to change policy. And then the final reason is just that the industry isn't slowing down, it's only speeding up. And we are also seeing an intensification, so farms are becoming more controlled, but we still don't really understand if this is worse or better for the shrimp. So those are the 5 questions and the reasons that I think we should start working on shrimp welfare more. There really is just a huge opportunity to start contributing to the literature on one of the most numerous farmed species. And there are great opportunities for influence and impact. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, thank you for a great talk. It makes me want to go into shrimp research, very systematic. I just wanted to ask, so at the beginning when you had like the list of severities, the eye stalk ablation was actually like relatively low severity. Was there a particular reason for that? Is it just a frequency, or is it actually, you know, how reliant is on their side?
Yeah, it's mostly related to the prevalence. So female breeder shrimp can spawn hundreds of thousands of shrimp. So relative to the 440 billion that are being slaughtered each year, there's only a few thousand to a few 100,000 of the female breeder shrimp. And because we weighted our results by the population affected, that's really the only reason it's that low down. But if I zoomed in on that, you would see that a lot of the pain is excruciating or disabling. There's just like we accounted for a possibility of a week after where the pain is getting less intense, but obviously the procedure itself is likely quite painful for the shrimp.
Thank you.
Thank you for a very thought-provoking presentation. I'm just curious, the wild caught, I come from a part of the world where we mainly eat wild caught shrimp. Is that better by any means? Should we promote wild caught? You didn't say anything about that, but it seems that most of the things you were talking about, they will not be affected. They'll be caught, and then that's unpleasant. So would you actually sort of, if one is going to be animal welfare friendly, should one buy wild caught shrimps rather than welfare certified farmed shrimps?
I think that's very context dependent. We haven't studied the wild implications much yet. People like Crustacean Compassion have a bit more, and there are definitely still some welfare issues involved in transportation if they're being transported live after being caught, and transportation on the boat from the sea to land. I don't know how they would weigh up against the farmed ones. I guess it might be slightly better for welfare, just given the scale of farming, if we can reduce demand for farmed shrimp. But I honestly don't know on an individual level how much the wild shrimp are suffering.
Hi, I'm Victoria Elliott from Wild Animal Initiative. I was supposed to be chairing the session, but I have a little colleague with me that prevented that. But thanks for a great talk. It was very thought-provoking. I wonder whether in the research questions you mentioned, you didn't talk about the life stages and that association with sentience. Is that something that you've thought about?
Yeah, a little bit. So that's related to there are some theories out there that say that we can expect animals to be sentient when they have to make decisions and move around their environment and receive feedback from the decisions that they've made. And larval shrimp are planktonic, so they're taken by the sea currents. They're not really making many decisions about how they move in the environment. So there are some people who think that maybe sentience develops over the life course and it only becomes necessary once they stop being planktonic and start being agentic in their environment. So it would be really useful to have studies of that life stage as well to understand whether that theory holds up or not.
Any other questions? Yep, yep.
Thanks. I'm Andrew Vose from Scottish Government. I was just wondering, having identified all this research that could be done, is it the role of Rethink Priorities to fund some of that work, or do you sort of help others do that work? Or if not, how should it be funded, do you think?
Rethink Priorities mostly tries to identify new opportunities to help farmed animals. We don't currently make any grants or anything. That's part of the reason I gave the talk, to try and encourage it to be moved into farmed animal welfare science. There aren't a lot of opportunities for funding still because it's such a new topic. But I think part of the work that could be done is going out and getting universities and other research institutions to start trying to fund the work.
Okay, thank you, Anna.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll switch to the second talk that will be given by Qing Yang, and you will talk about animal welfare from a Chinese perspective.
Thank you, everyone, and good afternoon. My name is Lisa Qing Yang, and I'm from mainland China. So this presentation is a small part of my PhD research project, which aims to identify effective strategies to encourage more cage-free egg production in China. So probably some of you already know that China is one of the largest poultry producers and consumers in the whole world. So in 2022, 3 billion laying hens were raised for egg production, and 11.8 billion broilers were raised for meat consumption. And most of the eggs in China are produced in cage systems. However, in the past 5 years or so, we start to see the transition from cage systems to cage-free systems. And this is mainly driven by the global animal welfare concerns and some international corporations' commitments in China who promised to source cage-free eggs by 2025. However, the transition is still very slow, and it is reported that 90% of the eggs are still produced in conventional systems. In contrast, in the broiler industry, the cages have been widely used for broilers to replace the traditional litter-based systems. In some regions in China, even 90% of the broiler production was produced in cages. So considering the large number of chickens used for egg and meat production in China, adopting or sustaining cage-free systems potentially impact billions of chickens' welfare. However, so far in China, we don't have legislation on animal welfare or production systems. So that means adopting cage-free systems is completely voluntary for the producers. So it's their own decision. And different factors affect the producers' decisions. So in Europe, there are some studies mainly conducted in the EU countries, and they found that the producers were affected by legislation, economic profitability, the availability of resources to transition, their knowledge or skills to use the new system, and their perceptions of animal welfare. In recent years, there are some studies in Asia and also including China, and we had similar findings as well, like social inferences, profitability, resources, and also knowledge and the skills. However, the research on the Chinese producers' perceptions of animal welfare, particularly concerning their choice of housing systems, is still very limited. So that is why our team decided to aim to investigate the Chinese egg and broiler producers' perceptions and their attitudes towards animal welfare in poultry production. And specifically, we're looking at their knowledge and the definitions of animal welfare, their attitudes towards it, and their perceived priorities in choosing a housing system and how they perceive the chickens. So I used the purposive and snowball sampling technique to recruit the participants. And I conducted a semi-structured interviews with 30 large-scale egg and broiler producers. And 15 of them were egg producers and 15 were broiler producers. And they were from the top 10 poultry production regions in mainland China. And these participants were farm owners, managers, or senior level leaders from the large-scale poultry production companies. So here is a summary of the scale of production of those farms where they came from. So for the caged egg farms, the sizes are between 11,000 to 30 million laying hens in annual stock. And for the cage-free farms, they mainly use a single level system. That is this picture, and every system or multi-tier system, and also free range. And the number of animals they house on the farms are between 10,000 to 20,000 to 200,000 hens. For the broilers, the cage farms produced 1.88 million to 520 million broilers every year for meat consumption. And for the cage-free farms, they produce 3 million to 323 million broilers every year. So here you can see the white ones that are mainly used for mainly housed in cages and litter-based systems, and they are the fast-growing breeds. And you can see the yellow ones. They are the slower breeding breeds, slower growing breeds, and they are called the yellow feathered broilers. And they are mostly housed in free-range systems. So here is the overview of our results. So in general, the participants had a high awareness and good knowledge of welfare, but animal welfare is not a priority for them to choose a housing system. Instead, profitability and leadership decisions are the major influences. And most of the participants perceived the chickens as production tools. So in the next section, I will quickly go through some quotes from the participants so that they can understand how they thought. So first one is the high awareness of awareness. So in this study, all the participants have heard the term animal welfare. This is important is because animal welfare does not exist in Chinese language. So it actually was translated from English, and then we have a Chinese term for that. And so it's also interesting to say that some cage-free egg producers, they actually use cage-free production interchangeably with the word animal welfare. For example, this free-range egg producer said, cage-free production means chickens can live freely and move freely, and that is what we call welfare farming. In terms of their knowledge of animal welfare, the participants understood animal welfare from 3 aspects, and it's very interesting to say that they actually had a very positive perspective on animal welfare. That means they look at animal welfare using good indicators. For example, they say animal welfare means good health and productivity, healthy birds, higher survival rate. And animal welfare means positive affective state, so animals can live a happy life. And animal welfare means behavioral opportunities, so they have the ability to move freely, and that is primary for animals' welfare. However, on the last aspect, the broiler producers are less supportive of the behavioral needs for broilers' welfare. This is mainly because they believe that the white feathered broilers, they were genetically bred to stay still, growing faster, and eat more. Therefore, there's no point to provide the space for the broilers to move freely. So in terms of the attitudes, regardless of their perspectives or how they defined animal welfare, only a couple of participants said that animal welfare was important for them in their production. And this free-range egg producer said, animal welfare is important because it is human welfare. And as producers, we have the responsibility to provide a better food choice for our consumers. And the majority of the participants did not perceive animal welfare as the highest priority. This is particularly true for the broiler producers. So like one cage broiler producer said, raising the broilers is like growing wheat and peanuts. So why do you care? Crops are crops. And another broiler producer said, our company's goal is to turn them into protein as fast as possible, so we do not consider animal welfare important. And a few broiler producers also expressed very strong opposition to the Western animal welfare standards. He said those standards are traditional view of welfare. What does that mean? It means those standards, they promote cage-free systems, they promote providing space for the animals to move, and they promote, say, enrichment for the environment. So he said, I believe cages are the higher welfare housing systems that suit China. And the Western animal welfare standards do not necessarily work in China. And another one also agreed and said the foreigners' practice of using floor-based systems are obsolete, and we will never go back to those systems. A couple of producers, broiler producers, they actually believed that the Western animal welfare standards are imposed Western ideology on the Chinese poultry production, poultry industry, and they believe it has been used as a political tool to restrict the development of Chinese poultry industry. Like this producer explicitly said, animal welfare is the largest hypocrisy in farming practices from the West. And when we are growing and developing, we challenge the West logic and we disagree with those standards. And another cage broiler producer said, using cages is a revolution, and we're leading this revolution by using the cages in broiler industry. So in this case, several producers mentioned that improving farm animal welfare must consider the Chinese context. What does it mean? What does that mean? It means the Chinese producers are under greater pressure to provide sufficient protein for a larger population with limited resources. So that is they believe it's very different from the Western context. Therefore, they said, we adopt this multi-level welfare farming system. So that's what they call the cages. And it is called a higher welfare farming model with Chinese characteristics. So animal welfare apparently is not a priority. Then what are? The primary priority is profitability. And several producers mentioned that profits are the major consideration when we transition to cages. And even for the cage-free egg producers, they did not transition only for animal welfare reasons. Instead, they believe the cage-free eggs have a better prospect and they can make more money for them. And as a producer concluded, the importance of animal welfare is based on cost-benefit analysis. Another factor affects the producer's decisions are the leadership's decisions. For example, for this farm manager, he said the farm owner wanted to produce cage-free range eggs. That's why they set up this free range farm. And another international egg production company, it was their European head office asked them to establish a cage-free farm. So that's why they did it. So in this case, for those cases, the decision on the housing systems was irrelevant to the producers, those participants' personal perspectives and values. So when I asked the producers, how do you perceive the chickens? Almost every one of them was really puzzled by my question. So only a few of them said, oh, I sympathize with the farm animals. However, most of them just said they are just production tools or they're just animal-based protein products. So here comes the conclusions. So the producers in this study generally have a high awareness and good knowledge of animal welfare. They have different conceptions. In particular, the broiler producers stress the importance of animal health, and the egg producers stress the animals' behaviors. And when choosing housing systems, the major influencing factors are profitability and the company's leadership's decisions. And the financial returns are prioritized more than animal welfare in poultry production. And the chickens are more seen as production tools rather than sentient individuals. And lastly, the egg producers appeared more supportive of cage-free systems than broiler producers. So the implications of our study is that it will be more strategic if we engage with the Chinese egg producers to encourage them to use cage-free systems to improve animal welfare in China. And also the market-based incentives might be more effective than using animal welfare education programs alone. So this is the end of my presentation, and I want to thank my PhD supervisors, and I also want to thank the founder for my PhD project. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Qing, for this very informative talk.
Are there any questions already down?
Hi
I
there.
don't have numbers.
Joe Garner here from Stanford. So I got to say that I really love what you did there. I have one methodological question, which is that you use snowball sampling. I
I've actually seen several papers recently where people working in China have used snowball sampling. I understand why that might be the case, but it's certainly not something we would do here. So did you do any attempt to look for bias within the snowballs? So for instance, did you look to see whether the correlation between attitudes between snowballs was because the snowballs aren't independent, right? Everybody in the same snowball are just friends. That's what's going on. So did you check to see if there was greater agreement within a snowball than between snowballs, and do any of those sort of standard sort of bias correction that you would want to do if you were using snowball sampling?
Yeah. So snowball sampling here, I mean, for those maybe who do not come from the similar research background. So it means like I know some connections in the industry for that target population, and but I probably don't know that many of them. So I just ask people to connect me to the targeted individuals that I want to talk to, just to do that. So it's like a snowball. I think initially I thought because the producers I know in the industry, some of them use cage-free systems, and some of them use cage systems. So initially I thought, oh, maybe for those cage-free producers, they will connect me to other cage-free producers who share similar points of view with them. And I think the results show that, yes, there is such like a connection. However, I think with the snowball going bigger and bigger, I just realized you saw the results. Not everyone favor the cage-free systems, and not everyone is supportive of animal welfare. So in that sense, I just feel the snowball sampling technique did not really affect like the results here.
Thank you for a very nice talk. And it's the first time I've seen a talk on consumers' view, so producers' view. We did a study in our group in Chinese consumers of pork products, and there was some acceptance, not as much as in the West, but some concern for animal welfare among Chinese consumers. Would you, if you had done the same studies about consumers in China, do you think you had a similar result, or do you think there will be this discrepancy that the producers are completely production-oriented, where some of the consumers may care more about welfare? I mean, like in the West, it was not the farmers who started interest for animal welfare. It came from the consumer view. Do you think you find a similar result if you go for poultry rather than pigs?
Yeah, I think there are a few elements I can mention here. First one is animal welfare is still a very new concept for the Chinese public and the consumers. And if we go back to the context we study, that is cage-free, which is even more strange for the Chinese consumers. They do not know what cage-free actually is. And there is a paper published, I think, last year to talk about Chinese consumers and their understanding of cage-free eggs. I think in that paper, it did mention that the consumers, they did not know what cage-free means, but by the literal meaning, looking at the word cage-free, they presume, okay, it means something nice, something birds can move freely. So that's why it's free there, you know, so there are no cages. So in that sense, I think we look at the segments of younger generations of consumers, well educated and who care about where their food comes from. For that segment of consumers, they definitely pay attention to this. If we can go back to this cage-free context, I still think the major buyers here will be the corporations, the one I showed on the slides, because they are the main drivers. And if we rely on the mass, group of consumers, it'd be like too slow. And that can be a long-term resolution for this. But for shorter term, we're looking at international business, food businesses.
We are already over time, so could you ask your question after the session? Sorry for that. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
So our next talk will be given by Szilvia Vetter from the University of Budapest in Hungary. Yeah, here you are.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the possibility for being here, and thank you very much for the fantastic organization of this conference. It's not the most fortunate situation to be one of the last presenters of a conference, but maybe this topic is suitable to generate some interest of the audience. My experience is like this. So in the following presentation, I would like to talk about zoophilia and animal welfare. So the connection of zoophilia and animal welfare, especially in Europe, focusing on the legal challenges and welfare concerns. I'm doing so because as a profession, I'm a lawyer. That's why the legal aspects are the most important for me. First, I would like to give you a small overview about the topic. Let's introduce the topic. So the very, very short and brief history of zoophilia. Let's define it. What is zoophilia exactly? Let's make a distinction. So I would like to make a clear difference between zoophilia and zoophilic acts. The latter has got legal aspects, the first one not. Let's categorize it. I would like to present you the 10 categories of zoophilia and their animal welfare, possible animal welfare implications. Should we criminalize it? Arguments for and against the criminalization of zoophilic acts. And zoophilic acts in the EU, a very short legal overview and some interesting facts. Last but not least, some preliminary results of a brand new Hungarian survey about the Hungarian population's opinion and experiences related to this topic. Okay, let's start with the brief history of zoophilia. Zoophilia or bestiality, these two are often used as synonyms. So any kind of desire or sexual attraction to animals is as old as mankind. Throughout the history, different types of contact with animals has not always been exclusively nutritional or utilitarian type, but included emotions and even sexual desire. The attitudes towards zoophilia have varied significantly throughout the history of mankind. There were times when it was accepted and times when it was even considered healthy for individuals, leading to the operation of animal brothels. For example, in the ancient Egypt, they somehow managed to form some form of sexual relationship even with crocodiles. I didn't know how they do that. It's absolutely surprise for me. But even in the ancient Egypt, they tried to cure nymphomania with zoophilia also. Even during the Renaissance era, for example, in Paris, in brothels, so with a close link to prostitution, turkeys were used to please the French gentleman. But I won't tell you the details. But at other times, it was very heavily prohibited, sometimes even punishable by death. For example, in the Middle Ages, if there were guilty people who were zoophiles, they were burned alive at stake with the guilty animals together. What is the situation nowadays? Most societies nowadays condemn and in some way sanction zoophilic acts. But what is zoophilia exactly? From the psychiatric point of view, it is classified among the so-called paraphilias, which are a group of sexual disorders where stimuli, which are considered to be bizarre or unusual or abnormal, are required for arousing sexual desire. These paraphilias have to appear repeatedly with a compulsive force. So any small piece of imagination is not enough to be to have paraphilia, of course. And this condition can be diagnosed if it is present continuously for at least half a year, so 6 months. We have two definitions here from the psychiatric point of view. The first one is the definition of the World Health Organization, which classifies zoophilia within mental and behavioral disorders. And we have a more concrete definition from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is always published by the American Psychiatric Association, which says, zoophilia is repetitive and intense sexual arousal directed at animals. We have to make a clear distinction between zoophilia and zoophilic acts. As I've already said, zoophilia is a paraphilia where an individual, a person, feels sexual attraction towards animals, but it can be purely mental and emotional. So it means that the individual may have only fantasies or desires without any action. But in the case of zoophilic acts refer to the physical engagement, physical action in some sexual activities with animals. That is rather called bestiality, this type of term, and this one has only legal relevance. I think this is a very interesting categorization of the different types of zoophilic acts. It's based on a mathematical categorization based on data from Agrawal and his co-authors. So Agrawal and his co-authors differentiated 10 different types, levels of zoophilia. I looked through all of these levels and tried to find the answer to the question, does any real sexual activity happen with a live animal? And is it relevant for animal welfare or not? As you can see in the first 3 cases, when we are talking about role-playing zoophile or a romantic zoophile, only with romantic thoughts about animals, or imaginative zoophile, there is no actual sexual activity, and it's not relevant from the aspect of animal welfare. In the case of tactile zoophile, where there is touching or rubbing, or fetishistic zoophile, these two can possibly have any connection to animal welfare. And the next 5 ones, so from sadistic zoophile to exclusively zoophilic people, all of them is relevant from the aspect of animal welfare, because either there is animal torture, animal cruelty there in the case of sadistic zoophile, or there is actual sexual activity with animals. There are some arguments for and against the criminalization of zoophilic acts. Very quickly, I could talk about all of it a much longer time, but time is running. So what are the arguments for criminalization? We can say that from the public morals point of view, it can be a good solution. There are human health considerations that think about some kind of zoonotic diseases here. The international trends are pointing to the way to criminalization of these deeds. There are strong animal welfare considerations, not the physical welfare of the animals, but also the mental welfare of the animals. What is about the dignity of animals? Is there, what does that mean, dignity of animals? From the lawyer's side, there is only very few countries in the world where there is the dignity of animals. Switzerland, the dignity of creatures is included in Switzerland in the constitution, but nowhere else in Europe. So from the lawyer's side, people have dignity, not animals. But from the ethical side, we can understand what does that mean. Is there a consent from the animals? I don't think so. There is some researches show a correlation with criminal offenses, so zoophilic acts and criminal offenses. There is some kind of tourism. There is the emergence of animal pornography industry, and it has got strong economic implications in the different countries, which are affecting at the last stage the image of the country. Some counter-arguments. Criminalization is so-called ultima ratio, which means legally that we are using the criminal punishment as the last resort when the other branches of law are not enough to punish or to sanction some acts. In many cases, treatment is rather needed. People are saying because it's a mental disorder in most of the cases. And from the practicability, these acts are quite hard to prove. A very short legal overview, and we are now at the end of the presentation. There was a decriminalization period from the 19th century by the mid-20th century, when the majority of the European states didn't sanction zoophilic acts in any way, partly due to the separation of ethics from the law. But later on, after the sexual revolution, the legislators are saying in Europe that everything is allowed for adults, not children, that absolutely sure, for adults with capacity to act. 2 or more adults with mutual content who have capacity to act can do anything what they like to do. But children, people without capacity to act, if there is no consent, absolutely banned by the law. Where should we put zoophilic acts from this perspective? It's not very easy to answer, but the fact is, in the last 10, 20 years, the trend has reversed. We have a recriminalization period. So most countries in Europe penalize either zoophilic acts or activities related to animal pornography products, or both, like the Netherlands and Poland. These 2 countries has absolutely So the legislation is good for these 2 aspects, with the possibility of imprisonment for a few months to several years. Some countries only penalize the production, the trade, the export, import of animal pornography products, while others also penalize the possession of this kind of products or promoting stuff like that, like, for example, Slovakia. And last but not least, this brand new research, what we made in Hungary. It wasn't a national representative survey, but we had quite a lot of respondents, 1,753 respondents. The higher education was overrepresented. And the key findings were the following. The great majority have already heard about zoophilia. 14% reported that they had encountered somehow personal zoophilic case in the environment or in friends or family. And most of these cases included dogs. the situation is same in the cases of animal cruelty, not only in Hungary, but I think in Europe. The great majority believe that this is unacceptable for both human health and animal welfare. These are two publications which we made in the last years regarding this subject. And if you have any questions, please feel free to get in touch with me, get in contact with me. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Szilvia. Szilvia, I guess we all learned many things here, so it was very interesting. Do we have any questions? Yeah, here. Oh, here. Sorry.
I'll ask.
Sorry.
That was very interesting. I'm from Vet Record. I'm Josh Loeb. I spoke to someone called Birgit Dettiner at the Sigmund Freud University of Vienna, who's researching zoophilia recently, because she gave a talk about this as well at a different conference. And she said that a lot of the people she comes across who are self-identified zoophiles actually are involved in sort of animal rights activities. I wondered if you could comment on whether you've observed anything similar. There seems to be a higher sort of rate of this within people who are involved in animal rights than maybe in the population at large. And maybe you could say whether you think that might also be the case in the community interested in sort of animal welfare as well as animal rights.
Very interesting question. Thank you very much. Zoophile people are used to form so-called subcultures in some countries. I think in all of the countries, they are using different net tools, forums, and they are communicating. They have an absolutely specific language, what they are using, and most of them saying that they are absolutely fond of their animals. They are good animal keepers, and animal welfare is important for them. I think that this approach from their side is quite common. From the other side, we have a lot of researches which show what happens with the animals, even if there is no physical harm. A lot of sources are saying that even if the animal cooperates somehow, looks like cooperating, it's rather due to a training which the animals went through than real desire to the humans. So I think it's quite complex, but from the animal welfare side, based on the literature, I don't think that these animals are also in love with people or show sexual desire. And animal rights activists in my country having a lot of experiences with abused and sexually abused animals as well. And they're saying that the mental rehabilitation of these animals takes much more time than the physical rehabilitation. Yeah.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I just have a comment about the lack of consent. I mean, we don't generally get consent for animals for what we do. I mean, if you want to ride a horse, you don't get consent. So I think the consent thing is a very complicated issue. But my question is more about the sort of what's happening in Europe. As part of it is in Western Europe is very much driven by animal rights movements. I'm just curious in Eastern Europe, where there's also very strong reversal of sexual tolerance towards homosexuals and other sexual minorities. Is there any link between these sort of reactions to LGBT culture and the reactions of zoophilia? I mean, in countries like Hungary or Poland, where there's already these other movements which are sort of goes against the sexual liberation you described back in the 1930s, most countries took these things away together with legislation against homosexuality. These things were banned. Now we see a counter-reaction against certain kinds of sexual devious behavior. Is there any link in the Eastern European context between these two things?
Thank you very much for the questions. You're absolutely right about riding the horse example and the content thing. But from the lawyer's side, this is rather I try to come from the lawyer's side, because, you know, when we are talking about sexual crimes, the content is a major core point of these crimes and these offending behaviors. For your other questions, so the difference between Western countries and Eastern or Middle European countries, also very interesting, because in the Western countries, the recriminalization happened earlier a bit. So at the beginning of the 21st century or earlier. In our case, for example, Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, and even Romania, these things are happening in the last decade or in the last years. The last was Romania 2 years ago, where you can get already 7 years of imprisonment for zoophilic acts, which is absolutely very high regarding all of the European countries. Interesting.
We are already over time, so thank you, Szilvia, again. It was very interesting. Please ask your question afterwards. Okay, now we will have our last talk for today. It will be given by Jessica Cait. It will be about enrichment, and Jessica is coming from the University of Guelph in Canada.
All right. I'm not sure how I'm going to follow that one up, but we'll see. So thank you so much to the organizers for having me and letting me speak today. I'm Jessica. I work with Dr. Georgia Mason at the University of Guelph, the Campbell Center for the Study of Animal Welfare. I'm going to talk to you about a study that we conducted recently that is currently in review in AABS, so hopefully in press at some point in the future. And we were asking the question, how much enrichment is enough? Okay, and what is this? Yes. Okay, so around the world, rodents usually live in these shoebox-sized cages. They tend to have bedding on the floor, and they have water, and they have food, and that can be pretty much it. And this is the common standard in a lot of countries that are prolific animal users or rodent users, so like the United States and China. Fortunately, we know that some countries actually mandate more than this minimum. So in Canada and the EU, we mandate more than that, so shelters or nesting material. Unfortunately, we know that some people don't actually meet these minimum standards. So here's an example of a paper we found from Germany that was using completely barren cages for their rodents. But more optimistically, we know that a lot of people actually go above these minimum standards in their own institutions. So I know the University of Guelph, where I work, we go above that. The University of Toronto has recently gone above that for their rats. And I know there's a lot of examples of people going above mandated minimums. And we know that resources like the ones that are mandated, but also a lot of others do matter for their welfare. So I just have a list here of several different resources that you can give to rodents that have been demonstrated in the literature to have benefits for welfare and physiological benefits as well. So things like additional space, cage complexity, nesting materials, shelter, and wheels. Also things like burrowing substrates, foraging opportunities, gnawing substrates, and then some other ones that you might not think of as much. Things like green odors have been demonstrated to be good for welfare, and things like highly palatable foods. And so we know that when rodents don't have access to these sorts of rodents, that they actually meet definitions of distress. So this is ILAR's definition, and they classify distress in lab rodents as underlying changes in physiological functions or immunosuppression that can change the progress of a disease and can contribute to morbidity and mortality. And so back in 2022, we published this systematic review and meta-analysis where we were comparing rodents housed in conventional cages versus ones in better, well-resourced cages. And we demonstrated really that these rodents, if they lack resources, they meet this definition. And we found that the morbidity results were true across a range of stress-sensitive diseases. So we looked at 5 different diseases, which were anxiety, cancer, cardiovascular disease, depression, and stroke. And it was true across all of these. But one thing we really weren't able to do in this study is address the question, how many resources is enough? And this is a question that we got a lot when we presented the work. Everyone said, okay, well, we meet minimum standards. Is that okay? Is that still considered conventional? Or we go above minimum standards. Is that okay? And we didn't really have an answer for people. And so we decided to look at that. And so to address this question, what we did is we actually went to human literature and used human literature on income and happiness as an analogy for potentially what how much is enough would look like. And so here's one example. There are a lot of human examples in the literature, but this is one specifically that's comparing income on the x-axis to subjective well-being scores on the y-axis. And so what you can see is at very low incomes, small increases in income actually have very large benefits for human happiness or self-reported happiness. But as income increases, so if you're making, this is a US graph, $400,000 a year or $600,000 a year, that might not increase your subjective happiness very much, maybe incremental benefits or maybe none at all. And so things seem to switch around this point, which is the living wage. So when people are making enough money to meet their basic needs. And so we wondered if a similar effect could be demonstrated in rodents. Maybe the same thing happens. So instead of income, we're looking at the number of resource types. So as rodents get more resources in their cages, their welfare will improve, but really will only improve to a point. At some point, we're going to be adding more and more, and it might not have huge benefits. And then on the other axis, of course, we're looking at rodent health or that distress metric. And so our hypothesis was that cages meeting more of a rodent's needs are better at reducing distress. Our prediction was that as more resource types are supplied to well-resourced rodents compared to their conventionally housed counterparts, their health benefits will increase. And then if that prediction was met, we also tested if, just like in the human literature, the relationship between the resources supplied and rodent health is nonlinear due to that diminishing returns that I showed on the previous graph. Okay, so what we were able to do is take our giant data set from our previous systematic review and look back at papers that we had included, and then also update that data set. And so these are the types of studies we were looking for. Here's 2 examples. On the left-hand side is a mouse cancer study. The right-hand side is a mouse anxiety study. These are the types of studies we were looking for. So we're looking for studies that had a conventionally housed group and a well-resourced, or what they'd probably call enriched group. And then the animals were treated identically. They were given one of our stress-sensitive diseases. And so the only difference between them was their housing condition. And so for all of these papers, what we were interested in doing is extracting data so we could calculate effect sizes. We specifically extracted data to look at standardized mean difference. And that just means how sick the animals were in one group compared to the other group. So the means, and then it was divided by the pooled standard deviation. And that allowed us to get a unitless summary statistic that we were able to compare across diseases and across animals. And then on top of calculating our standardized mean difference, we also extracted what was in each cage type. So we had a list of 10 resources that were demonstrated to be good for welfare previously in literature. And these happen to be the 10 I showed you in the introduction. I don't need to go through them right now, but the point is that we gave each study a score out of 10 for the number of resources it provided in addition to what was in the conventional condition. So if we go back to the examples I showed previously, in the mouse cancer study, you can see that in the conventional cage, it was completely barren, so there were no resources. But in the well-resourced cage, there were shelters. So this was given a score of 1 out of 10 because it had 1 resource. The difference is in the anxiety study, the conventional cage actually had nesting material, but the well-resourced cage actually had 3 resources above that. So it had nesting material, but it also had additional space, it had shelters, and it had cage complexity. So this was given a score of 3 out of 10. So we screened a lot of papers for eligibility. It was over 10,000. We found 208 articles that had 250 54 relevant studies of different groups of animals. And in practice, studies only supplied a maximum of 5 of our resources. Those were complexity, nesting, shelters, space, and wheels. So we weren't actually able to score out of 10. All of the scores ended up being out of 5. And so in addition to what was provided to conventionally housed rodents, 46% of well-resourced cages supplied 1 resource, 7% provided 2, 8% provided 3, 28% 4, and 11% provided 5. And so then we tested if the number of resource types provided to well-resourced rodents predicted the standardized mean difference, so how sick, differentially sick the animals got between groups. That's our metric of rodent health. And then we tested if the relationship was nonlinear by including the log of resource type in the meta-analysis models and by conducting lack of fit tests. Okay, so the data is quite noisy, and unfortunately, this is one of the consequences of working with meta-analytic data because we're not really able to design our own perfect study. But what you can see, so on the x-axis is the number of resource types, and on the y-axis is the standardized mean difference. A standardized mean difference of 0 means there's no difference between the groups, and a standardized mean difference of 1 would be considered quite large. So as you can see, we have a very large range of effect sizes here, but they're also colored. So the yellow studies are small, the orange studies are medium-sized, and the red studies are large. And in the meta-analyses, these are actually weighted. So those studies showing very, very large effects tend to be very small studies that don't impact the model much. So if we zoom in a little bit on the biologically relevant effect sizes, the relationship becomes a little bit more clear. And we found, there's a little flick to the bottom, sorry. But we found that there was a significant relationship with the number of resource types predicting the standardized mean difference. And so for each resource type that was added, the standardized mean difference was increased by 0.1. And the logarithmic relationship did not yield a better model fit, and our lack of fit test did not indicate a significant diversion from linearity. So we did not see any indication of diminishing returns over these 5 resources that we had. But of course, again, the data are quite noisy, so interpret with caution. And one big reason for this too is that the relationship between welfare and resources is likely far more complicated than just how much is there. So of course, some resources are likely to be a lot more valued than other resources. Unfortunately, with this data set, with poor reporting in the literature and some confounds, we really weren't able to say which ones. And also we know that not all resources of the same type are actually equal. So for example, mice prefer certain wheel types than others. So even though 2 cages might provide the same resource, they might actually be very different for the rodents. So researchers still need to observe their animals. Don't just add a bunch because of course it's going to be dependent on the situation and the types of animals you have. So if we go back to our human analogy, and this is what the rodent example might look like, the number of resource types is on the x-axis and welfare on the y-axis. And it might look something like this. So 1 resource is better than having 0 resources, but up to 5, we're still quite far on the left-hand side of the graph. And we really haven't, based on the data that we have, found that tipping point that would be analogous to humans getting a living wage. And so really what we need to do is continue to do studies like this, ideally primary studies that could address this question, adding resources like the other 5 that we weren't able to assess, and see where that tipping point is. Where is it that it starts to have diminishing returns and matters less? And so just to conclude here, meeting more rodent needs was better at reducing distress. So going above, meeting minimum standards is good for welfare. So that's great for the countries that are mandating that and people who meet those standards. But if we can go above those standards, that's better too. Providing more than 5 resources might be important for hitting the point of diminishing returns. So we should really think about doing that, adding more than just those 5 that are common in the literature. And I'll leave you with this point too, which is that we are using these animals to model humans and human diseases. And so if we want to model a wide range of human beings, we might need to add more than the minimum because we might only be modeling people who are making less than a living wage right now. So with that, I would just like to thank my systematic review team, the Mason Lab, the Campbell Center for the Study of Animal Welfare, and NSERC that funded the work. And I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Jessica. Here we have a question.
Thanks for the really great talk. I'm just asking the question about your final model. Is it possible that you're already at the flat bit and that actually, given the constraint of the shoebox size, you're not going to get anything more than a flat line?
Yeah, so I have thought about that a lot, that we might just be at the top there. I think what convinces me that we're not is that the data should go through the origin. So if you have no resources in the two groups, you should have no difference in the number of resources and no difference in the amount of disease they experience. So it should really go through zero. And we don't see any like obvious curve there that we go flat. It's still linear. So that indicates to me that we're still on that far portion. But again, with really noisy meta-analytic data, like I was impressed we were able to find any relationship, but I would still reserve like caution for interpreting the results.
I'm just curious whether you think money is the right analogy with humans, particularly at the higher level, where really that's not a resource, it's offering them a choice of resources, the humans who've got lots of money. So at the early stage, there probably isn't much choice because they spend it on housing and food, which is the living wage. But later on, they're sort of overwhelmed with choice. And maybe that's not the right analogy. Or if we're trying to model that in rodents, we could try and offer them choice or something.
Okay, that's interesting. I think we were using money really just as like an ability to access resources. And you're absolutely right. At some point, you're accessing all those resources. And we know that choice is a very important part of animal welfare and human welfare. So, I mean, if you have a suggestion for another analogy to use, but we've used just income, and then there's other studies that have looked at like GDP across countries that show similar things.
Lovely work. So exciting to see this. Brianna Gaskell, Novartis. One of the things that I've always, and I think you may have touched on this a little bit at the end, I love this work, but one of the things that when I show it to scientists, they want to know, well, this is just correlational work. And are you thinking about trying to partner with any of the labs that may have started some of this work and see if maybe you could do some kind of addition of different types of enrichments to kind of get at your answer in a more structured study that you could use the disease expert as a partner?
I would love to do that. I have not. My stuff has kind of navigated towards more other meta-analysis questions. No, but I think that's an excellent idea, is partnering with some biomedical researchers who would be interested in doing this work, because yeah, it is really hard to get people on board. I know there's a lot of barriers to asking people to improve their cages, particularly financial ones. So yeah, if we were able to partner with some of these cancer researchers or something, that would be fantastic.
There was another question there.
So I want to ask, you kind of assume this relationship that would continue to be positive, however many resources you added, but can you anticipate any problems with, for example, competition between cage mates, or perhaps things like when you have lots of different activities in a place where in the wild you might not climb, eat, fight in the same kind of space, that might actually have negative effects on their welfare?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So one of the modifiers we had in our meta-analysis was something that we called red flags. So there were a bunch of different factors that we thought actually might be negative for welfare. And we thought that we would have smaller effects or even negative effects in them. We didn't see anything, but what we looked at was being co-housed male mice, because resources could increase aggression, being old mice because they might have neophobia. We had 5 of them, but I can't remember all of them right now. Yeah, but we did consider potential negative impacts of the resources, and we did not see an effect.
Any other question? We still have some time this time. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Very good talk. Just want to say I can add a little bit to that because in our group, Mike and Emma, they had a grant. We're looking into do male mice prefer to live on their own, and they've done a study about adding extra enrichment based on how they were housed. And because obviously that, I guess in those mice from your meta-analysis, they were group housed. So I guess whatever single group or pair, that is a huge factor adding on to the enrichment as well, because what we found was that the more enrichment group housed mice got, the more fights we saw and the more severe injuries we saw. So how was the housing situation in your studies?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. It's a good one. We included their social housing status as a modifier in our models. So we had, singly housed and group housed, and then not defined as our three categories. We didn't see any effect of being singly housed or group housed. But I am conducting another study right now looking at the impact of social isolation on rodent health. And we are going to combine it with this data set, including studies that confounded social housing with enrichment, and maybe we'll be able to pull something out of there.
Okay, thank you then,
Thank you.
Jessica. Thank you. Okay, so we're already at the end of our session. So we'd like to thank the 4 speakers of this session. These were very good, very interesting talks and very diverse. I really like each of them.